In May 2013, a violent storm tore through the North Sea and slammed into a quiet stretch of coastline in Norfolk, England, called Happisburgh. Storms hit that coast constantly. It's one of the fastest eroding shorelines in Europe. Entire houses have literally fallen into the sea there over the decades, and the local council has had to relocate roads and even a section of clifftop caravan park further inland just to stay ahead of the encroaching water. But this particular storm ripped away a thick layer of beach sand that had sat undisturbed for the better part of 1,000,000 years. And underneath it, a team of archaeologists working the site found something that made absolutely no sense to them at first. A series of strange, elongated hollows pressed into a flat gray surface of ancient silt, dozens of them arranged in what looked disturbingly like a trail. Dr. Nick Ashton of the British Museum, who led the team, later admitted that at first they genuinely weren't sure what they were looking at. It was only as they carefully sponged the seawater away, hollow by hollow, that the shapes resolved into something unmistakable. Heels, arches. In at least one case, individual toes. These were footprints, human footprints, and the sediment they were sitting in was already known from a decade of prior excavation at the same site to be somewhere between 850,000 and 950,000 years old. Let that sink in for a second, because the scale of it is genuinely difficult to process. Recorded human history goes back roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years. The pyramids of Giza are about 4,500 years old. These footprints predate the pyramids by more than 800,000 years. They predate the extinction of the woolly mammoth. They predate the emergence of our own species, Homo sapiens, by something like 700,000 years. Whoever left them wasn't just early. They were walking across a muddy riverbank in what would one day become England before modern humans existed anywhere on Earth, in any form at all. And the team knew, standing there on that beach, that they had almost no time to do anything about it. The tide was already coming back in. Exposed to open air and seawater for the first time in the better part of 1,000,000 years, this ancient surface would start disintegrating within days. So they did the only thing they could. Working at speed, in freezing wind and rising water, they photographed every square inch of it using a technique called multi-image photogrammetry, stitching together hundreds of overlapping photographs to build a precise three-dimensional digital model of the entire surface before the sea took it back for good. Within about 2 weeks, the footprints were gone, washed away, exactly as everyone expected. Today, the only place they still exist is inside that digital model, a set of files sitting on a hard drive at the British Museum, a permanent record of something the physical world has already erased, and one of the very few times in the entire history of archaeology that a discovery of this magnitude has existed for scientists to study for barely a fortnight before vanishing forever. The findings were formally announced to the public on the 7th of February 2014, and the headline number alone was staggering enough to make global news. These were, at the time of announcement, the oldest hominin footprints ever discovered outside the continent of Africa. Not close. The previous record holder, a set of tracks called the Ciampate del Diavolo, the Devil's Trail, preserved in volcanic ash at Roccamonfina in Italy, dated to around 350,000 years old. Happisburgh beat that by roughly 500,000 years in one single discovery. Only 2 footprint sites on the entire planet are older, and both are in East Africa. The extraordinary 3.6 million-year-old Latoli footprints in Tanzania, discovered by Mary Leakey's team in 1976, thought to belong to Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as the famous skeleton known as Lucy, and the roughly 1.5 million-year-old tracks at Illoret in Kenya, attributed to Homo erectus. Everywhere else on Earth, nothing this old had ever survived. Footprints are astonishingly fragile things. They need an almost impossibly precise sequence of luck to survive even a few thousand years, let alone the better part of 1,000,000. Soft enough mud to take a clear impression followed almost immediately by a gentle, undisturbed burial under more sediment before rain, wind, tides, or scavenging animals destroy the impression. And then nearly 1,000,000 years without the layer being crushed, folded, eroded away, or geologically disturbed. Happisburgh had somehow beaten those odds. Once the team analyzed the full surface properly, the picture that emerged was almost eerily intimate. They identified at least 5 separate individuals, and possibly more, river estuary. The prints ranged enormously in size, from around 14 centimeters up to 26 centimeters in length, which translates to estimated heights running from as small as 0.93 meters, roughly the height of a modern 3-year-old, all the way up to 1.73 meters, about 5'8", solidly adult-sized by today's standards. In other words, this wasn't a single hunter passing through alone. This was very likely a family group, or something functioning like one, adults of varying builds and children moving together deliberately along a riverbank. Careful analysis of the elongated shape of each hollow showed that the group was walking in a consistent southerly direction, upstream, against the current of the river. And that river itself is one of the most quietly mind-bending details in this entire story. It wasn't just any river. Geological analysis of the sediment identified it as an early course of the River Thames, flowing not through modern London as it does today, but much further north, cutting straight across what is now East Anglia, out into a wider, colder sea, at a time when Britain wasn't an island at all. It was still physically joined to mainland Europe by a broad chalk landmass linking southeast England to northern France, a landscape modern researchers sometimes call Doggerland. Anyone standing on that ancient riverbank, human or otherwise, could in principle have walked uninterrupted all the way to what is now Germany or Denmark or northern Spain without ever getting their feet wet in open sea. So who were they? This is where the story stops being simple and where the title of this video actually comes from, because more than a decade after this discovery, scientists still cannot say for certain which species of ancient human left those prints, and the reason why is almost stranger than the footprints themselves. Not one single bone, tooth, or fragment of skeleton has ever been found at Happisburg. Not one. Everything. Scientists know about the people who walked across that mud flat comes exclusively from the shape of the holes their feet left behind, and from a scatter of stone tools and butchered animal bones found in the same sediment layers over the previous decade of digging. There is no skull to study, no jawbone to measure, no DNA to extract directly from the site itself. Which means the species identification isn't really a discovery at all, in the strictest sense. It's a deduction, built entirely from indirect evidence, and different teams of scientists looking at exactly the same indirect evidence have reached genuinely different conclusions. The leading candidate, and the one you'll see attached to most headlines about this discovery, is a species called Homo antecessor. It's known almost exclusively from a single extraordinary site on the other side of Europe, a cave system called Grandolina in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, where fossil remains from at least 6 individuals, dated to a similar age as Happisburg, were unearthed in the 1990s. Homo antecessor fossils fall within a similar height and build range to what the Happisburg footprints suggest, and for years that made it the tidiest explanation on offer. A plausible ancient population that could have wandered from Iberia up through a still-connected Europe and eventually reached the muddy edge of Britain's early Thames. The original 2014 research paper describing the footprints explicitly leaned toward this candidate, noting that Homo antecessor was, at the time, the only confirmed hominin species known to have lived in Western Europe at anything close to the right date, which made it the default answer almost by process of elimination rather than direct proof. But it isn't the only explanation on the table. A later reanalysis of the footprint shapes, published in 2020, argued that the Happisburg prints actually bear a closer structural resemblance to a completely different set of ancient tracks, the 1.5 million year old Illiret footprints from Kenya, which are attributed not to Homo antecessor at all, but to Homo erectus, a species that first evolved in Africa and is known to have spread as far as Southeast Asia, reaching sites in modern-day Indonesia and China. If that comparison is right, it would mean the population that reached Britain wasn't necessarily connected to the Spanish fossils at all, but was potentially descended from an entirely separate, older wave of migration out of Africa, one that pushed north into Europe by a completely different route and timeline than anyone had previously mapped. Homo erectus is, notably, the longest surviving human species we know of, persisting in parts of Asia for well over 1 million years, and possibly overlapping in time with early Homo sapiens. So extending its known range into northern Europe at this early date would itself be a genuinely significant finding, independent of Happisburg altogether. 2. Respected teams of scientists, looking at the exact same set of footprints, arrived at 2 genuinely different candidate species. And as of right now, nobody has definitively settled which one, if either, is correct. That unresolved contradiction is the honest, factual reason the footprints genuinely don't cleanly match any single confirmed human species. It isn't a mystery being manufactured for a headline. It's a real, ongoing gap in the fossil record that scientists openly acknowledge. And here's where the story takes a turn that connects directly to some of the most cutting-edge biological science happening right now, because the very species at the center of this debate, Homo antecessor, has its own genuinely wild recent history involving ancient DNA. In April 2020, a team led by researchers at the University of Copenhagen, working with Spain's National Research Center on Human Evolution, announced that they had retrieved the oldest set of human genetic data ever recovered from an 800,000-year-old tooth belonging to a Homo antecessor individual from that same Atapuerca cave system in Spain. To put that achievement in context, DNA itself is a fragile molecule that degrades chemically over time, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments the older a sample gets, until eventually there's simply nothing left to sequence. And until this study, the oldest human genetic material ever successfully sequenced from anywhere on Earth was around 400,000 years old, roughly half this age, recovered from Cima de los Huesos, another site inside the very same Atapuerca mountain range. So how did the Copenhagen team push the record back so much further? They didn't extract raw DNA at all, because DNA that old simply doesn't survive intact in usable form. It's chemically gone long before you reach the 800,000 year mark under normal conditions. Instead, they used a technique called paleoproteomics, essentially using a mass spectrometer to identify surviving fragments of ancient proteins preserved in the incredibly hard, dense enamel of the tooth, proteins being far more chemically stable and long-lasting than DNA itself, and then working backward from the specific amino acid sequence of those proteins to reconstruct fragments of the underlying genetic code that must have originally produced them. It's a genuinely ingenious piece of biological detective work, squeezing genetic information out of a fossil that was, by every conventional standard of ancient DNA research, far too old to ever yield any usable genetic evidence at all, and it's opened up an entirely new frontier for studying human fossils that were previously considered scientifically silent. What they found scrambled the existing family tree. For years, the leading theory, based purely on the shape and structure of the Atapuerca bones, was that Homo antecessor might actually be the elusive last common ancestor of three major human lineages: us, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and the more recently discovered Denisovans, a group known mostly from fragmentary remains in Siberia and identified almost entirely through genetic analysis rather than complete skeletons. If that had turned out to be true, it would have made this obscure Spanish population, and by extension possibly the people who left the Happisburg footprints, the direct root of every single human being alive on Earth today. But the actual protein evidence told a more complicated story. According to Led aus Accident Panf, researcher Frido Welker, the genetic data instead pointed to Homo antecessor being a sister group, a closely related population that split off the family tree near that critical branching point, but wasn't itself the trunk. In other words, close cousins of our direct ancestors, not the ancestors themselves. It's a subtle distinction, but a genuinely important one because it means the actual common root that eventually produced modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, is still out there in the fossil record somewhere, unfound, probably living sometime between 700,000 and 900,000 years ago, in a population scientists haven't identified yet, quite possibly in exactly the right geographic and chronological window to include whoever left their footprints on that Norfolk riverbank. There's one more detail about Homo antecessor that almost never makes it into the headline version of this story, and it's genuinely unsettling. When the original bones were excavated at Grandolina in the 1990s, researchers noticed something disturbing about many of them. They were cut, scored, and fractured in patterns consistent with deliberate butchery, the same kind of cut marks archaeologists routinely find on animal bones that have been processed for meat. The leading interpretation among the original excavation team was that this evidence pointed toward cannibalism, quite possibly as a routine, repeated behavior within the group rather than a one-off act of desperation, based on the number of individuals and bones showing the same pattern across multiple excavation seasons. Whether the people who walked across the mud flat at Happisburg, 700 miles north, shared any of that same behavior is completely unknown and entirely unprovable from footprints alone. But it's a genuinely striking thing to sit with, that the leading scientific candidate for who left Britain's oldest footprints is a population whose closest known relatives in Spain appear to have eaten their own dead. Zoom out from Happisburg for a moment, and a much bigger, stranger pattern starts to emerge about Britain's deep prehistory as a whole, because Happisburg isn't remotely the end of this story, it's just the earliest known chapter of it, and arguably one of the most important ideas to come out of decades of research into this period is that Britain's human history isn't really a single continuous line at all. It appears to have been repeatedly colonized, then abandoned, then recolonized over and over again as the climate swung wildly between brutal glacial periods and warmer interglacial spells throughout the Ice Age. Each time the ice advanced far enough south, Britain would have become genuinely uninhabitable, and whichever population of early humans was living there either died out locally or retreated south into continental Europe. Then, when conditions warmed again and the landscape became livable, a new wave, sometimes the descendants of the same population, sometimes an entirely different species altogether, would push back in. The next major chapter, after Happisburg, comes from a site called Boxgrove in Sussex, where researchers found an actual shin bone and 2 teeth, genuine skeletal remains this time belonging to a hominin nicknamed Boxgrove Man, dated to around 480,000 years ago, and tentatively assigned to a later species called Homo heidelbergensis, generally considered a strong candidate for the direct ancestor of Neanderthals. After that came the Neanderthals themselves, present in Britain in phases from roughly 400,000 years ago, then vanishing again during especially harsh glacial periods, then reappearing. Modern Homos. Sapiens, our own species, the kind of human writing and reading this sentence, didn't actually set foot on British soil until roughly 40,000 years ago, which means that for something like 96% of the entire time any kind of human being has walked on this island, it wasn't us doing the walking at all. Happisburg's location within that longer story matters enormously because it currently sits right at the very beginning of the entire known record, the absolute earliest confirmed toehold of any human population, of any species, anywhere in Northern Europe. And what makes it even more remarkable is the environment those people were apparently living in. This wasn't some balmy Mediterranean-style climate. Analysis of ancient pollen, plant remains, and animal bones preserved in the same sediment layers shows a landscape of open grassland along the river valley, grazed by extinct species of horse, deer, mammoth, and even hippopotamus during warmer phases, with the surrounding higher ground covered in dense coniferous forest, all under conditions colder than anything southern Europe experiences today. Whoever these people were, Homo antecessor, Homo erectus, or some population science hasn't even given a name to yet, they were surviving at the genuine edge of the habitable world for early humans, roughly 1,500 miles further north than any other confirmed evidence of hominin activity from the same era anywhere on the planet at the time. No confirmed evidence exists that they had fire, tailored clothing, or permanent shelter at this early date, which makes their presence there, at this latitude, at this point in deep time, one of the single most surprising facts in the entire story of human evolution. It's also worth understanding just how much of this discovery and the ongoing work at the site depends on exactly the kind of digital and computational techniques that feel almost futuristic when you place them next to something 900,000 years old. That photogrammetry process used to save the footprints before the tide destroyed them wasn't some crude sketch and measure job. It involves stitching together hundreds of overlapping digital photographs into a precise three-dimensional model accurate down to individual millimeters, essentially building a permanent, endlessly zoomable, endlessly analyzable digital twin of a surface that no longer physically exists anywhere on Earth. Researchers can still, right now, more than a decade after the original footprints washed away, go back into that digital model and remeasure, rescan, or reanalyze the data using techniques that didn't even exist back in 2013. The combination of ancient fossil evidence and cutting-edge digital capture and analysis is quietly becoming the standard method for this entire field, because Britain's coastline is eroding so fast that archaeologists are now in a permanent race against the sea itself. And increasingly, the choice isn't between preserving a site perfectly or imperfectly. It's between capturing a precise digital record of it before it's gone forever, or losing the information completely and irreversibly. That race is still very much ongoing today. The wider excavation project at Happisburg, run jointly by the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, and several university partners under names like the Ancient Human Occupation of Britain Project, and its successor, Pathways to Ancient Britain, has continued working the site and the surrounding coastline for 2 decades now, and continues to turn up new material as fresh erosion exposes fresh sediment. A separate team from the University of Southampton has even identified what may be the world's oldest underwater archaeological site, submerged sections of the same ancient river system, the Cromer Forest bed, now sitting beneath the north. Sea itself, holding the tantalizing possibility of further stone tools, animal remains, or conceivably even more footprints from the same vanished population, still waiting to be found in sediment that hasn't seen open air in the better part of 1 million years. Every single storm that batters that stretch of Norfolk coastline is simultaneously a threat and an opportunity, capable of destroying evidence that survived nearly 1 million years in a single tide, or exposing something entirely new that nobody has ever seen before. So where does that actually leave the mystery? More than a decade on from that storm in May 2013, the honest scientific answer is still genuinely unresolved, and there's something almost refreshing about a piece of prehistory this significant that hasn't been artificially tidied up into a clean, simple headline. We know, with very high confidence, based on multiple independent geological dating methods, including pollen analysis, sediment stratigraphy, and comparison with known glacial and interglacial cycles, that a small group of early humans, at least 5 individuals ranging from small children to fully grown adults, walked together along the muddy bank of an ancient river in what is now Norfolk, somewhere between 850,000 and 950,000 years ago, making them the earliest confirmed humans, anywhere in Northern Europe and the owners of the oldest footprints ever found outside Africa. What we still don't know, and what nobody currently has enough physical evidence to prove beyond doubt, is precisely which branch of the human family tree they belong to. Homo antecessor remains the most geographically and chronologically plausible candidate, but the same population's own DNA, or more precisely its own fragmentary ancient proteins, has already rewritten our understanding of exactly where that species sits in relation to us, revealing it as a close cousin rather than a direct ancestor, and quietly reopening the question of who our own actual common ancestor with Neanderthals and Denisovans really was. Homo erectus remains a live alternative based purely on the shape of the prints themselves, an equally ancient but geographically distant possibility that nobody has been able to rule out. And it's entirely possible neither answer is right, and that the true owners of the Happisburg footprints belong to some third population that hasn't been formally identified anywhere in the fossil record yet. A population that existed, thrived enough to raise children in one of the coldest inhabited environments on the planet at the time, and then vanished from Britain, either through local extinction or retreat back to the continent, leaving nothing behind except a few dozen footprints and some scattered stone tools. Somewhere out there, in ground that hasn't been excavated yet, or in sediment that's still sitting undisturbed under the North Sea, or possibly in a layer that's already been washed away and lost forever before anyone got the chance to look at it, is the actual physical evidence that would finally settle the question for good. A single tooth, a fragment of skull, anything with enough surviving protein, or if science keeps advancing at its current pace, perhaps even usable DNA that could finally put a definitive name to the species. Every storm that hits that stretch of Norfolk coastline now carries that same double-edged possibility it did back in 2013, the chance of revealing the evidence that finally solves this, or the chance of destroying it in the same tide that exposed it, before a single archaeologist even knows it existed. Until that day comes, whichever it turns out to be, the family who left their footprints on that riverbank almost 1 million years ago remain exactly what they've been since the moment the tide first swept the sand away from over them. The earliest known people in northern Europe, walking south along a vanished river, in a country that wasn't yet an island belonging to a species that science still can't quite name.